appreciate when you work in the White House is that the United States is the only nation that is really able to mobilize collective action among the nations of the world. And so if you look at the successes under the Obama presidency, there were always moments when the United States was able to marshal other nations behind a common goal. So on the Paris Climate Accord, that was a US effort over many years to bring up to 200 nations into a climate change agreement. The Iran nuclear agreement, the United States working with Britain, France, Germany, Russia, China, the European Union, and Iran over many years to get to a nuclear agreement. The response to the Ebola epidemic, in which the United States essentially had to use its unique capabilities to build infrastructure around public health in West Africa, and then go and get contributions from many other nations around the world. I think Americans don't fully appreciate how much the United States stands at the center of this network of institutions and alliances that people like yourself helped to build, that is really the only option that the world has to turn to solve difficult problems.
Do you think
that's the good news?
Do you think that that prestige, that power, that stature is as great today as it's ever been, or is it somewhat diminished?
Well, I think it's diminished, and this gets to the bad news. I think that there was always going to be some diminishment of the dominance that the United States had over global affairs after the Cold War. It was inevitable that nations like China were going to emerge, that nations like Russia were going to push back. However, I think we made some of our own mistakes. Chiefly, I think that after 9/11, the overwhelming focus on terrorism, and then particularly the Iraq War, led nations to both lose some degree of confidence in American leadership. The Iraq War, I think, was a huge blow to US credibility. But also, we were focused on terrorism to the exclusion of other issues that people cared about around the world. You know, terrorism was our top issue for a lot of years, and you and I worked together on issues like the 9/11 Commission, but issues around inequality and climate change and education and economic growth, those are the preeminent concerns of a lot of other nations. And so I think there was already a period of time when there was a sense that American global leadership wasn't focused on the issues that many nations and people around the world cared about the most. And then I think with President Trump, you had the United States essentially turn away from the world. And there are any number of issues we could talk about, but I think the most profound one is that the United States not only is the most powerful nation, but we have a legitimacy around our leadership because of democratic values and because of our open society and because of our openness to immigration, because people in this country are from all over the world. And I think President Trump turning his back on those democratic values and closing his door to that kind of immigration and openness to the world, that has had a bigger negative impact on US standing than any one policy that he's had. And so I think we're in a position now where, on the one hand, the US is the only nation that can mobilize that type of collective action I spoke about. But on the other hand, the credibility of the United States as a nation that uses its power wisely and as a nation that stands for a set of values has been badly set back over the last 2 decades. And with an incoming Biden presidency, I think the imperative is going to be to try to build back both that credibility as a global leader and that credibility as an example to the world of a set of values that are under significant threat in this country and around the world.
I want to return to that in a few minutes, but I want to talk to you also right now about the impact of the American people on American foreign policy. A relatively few number of people focus on foreign policy. People have busy lives. They've got a lot of other things on their agenda, and they can pay only so much attention to American foreign policy. What do you think the impact and the influence is of American public opinion on policymakers?
Well, I think there's a couple of dimensions to this. I mean, the first thing is that increasingly I see a complete blurring of the lines between domestic and foreign policy. if you look about the issues that a lot of Americans care about today, there's really no borders around those issues. If you care about climate change, there's no solution to that problem that lies only within this country. We have to do certain things, and we have to get other nations to do certain things. If you look at the pandemic that we're all living under, a good response to that pandemic, which we did not have, would not just have included the United States working more aggressively and competently at home, but it would have involved the United States working with China and other countries to try to contain the outbreak and to control the spread of the virus. If you look at global inequality, there's no way to really get at that issue just through domestic economic policies. It requires working with other countries around who are the winners in the global economy and how do we make sure that there are more of them, and how do we make sure that trade agreements benefit more people, including the American workers and the American middle class here at home. So the first point, I think, is that Americans should recognize there's really no distinction between foreign and domestic policy. The problem I see, Lee, is that the politics of American foreign policy have been negative. First of all, because I think there's a lot of fear mongering around these issues. And so oftentimes they enter our political debate when politicians are trying to make Americans afraid of refugees, or to make Americans afraid of immigrants across our southern border, or to make Americans afraid of the religion of Islam. And then I think you have a very constituency-based foreign policy. If you look at the Trump foreign policy, there are things that didn't make any sense, like tearing up the Iran nuclear agreement, or like recognizing an alternative leader of Venezuela without a strategy to affect the circumstances in Venezuela. I worked a lot on Cuba policy, where American foreign policy is driven, and congressional focus on foreign policy, which you know a lot about, of course, is driven by constituencies here in the United States that lead us to over prioritize certain things. Iran and Cuba, the two things I worked on the most probably in government, there's been this enormous focus on these relatively small countries relative to the big issues like climate change and pandemics that I talked about. So I think that the American public's interaction with these issues through politics often leads to a strange set of prioritizations and doesn't lead to constructive policy outcomes.
I couldn't help but notice your comments on the Congress and foreign policy. Give me a sense of your feel about the role of the Congress in implementing and formulating both American foreign policy. Would we be better off not to have it, or are we better off to have some input from the Congress? And if so, what kind of input do you think is helpful?
Well, I think that there can be incredibly constructive input from Congress. And if you look at the policies that are able to be sustained over many years with congressional support, those tend to be the most successful American foreign policies. There's been multi-decade support for American alliances in Congress. There's been congressional support for some of our most successful development programs, like the PEPFAR program to deal with the HIV/AIDS crisis. In individual countries, the American focus on and congressional focus on support for Colombia helped them deal with an insurgency, ultimately make a peace agreement, and become a much more stable and prosperous country. So there's a constructive input that Congress plays. I think Congress also often is an advocate for democracy around the world in ways that are constructive, both in terms of funding civil society and in terms of supporting dissidents and people who might otherwise be forgotten around the world who are standing up for democratic values. That's all to the good. I think the negative engagement that you see sometimes from Congress is increasingly in the space of trying to politicize certain issues. We dealt with congressional constraints that were mainly focused on trying to prevent Barack Obama from doing certain things. So for instance, we could not close the prison at Guantanamo Bay, even though it made no sense. It was a huge stain on our reputation globally. It cost millions of dollars a year for each prisoner to be there when They could have been in supermax facilities in the United States, or they could have been transferred back to other countries. But Congress imposed all of these restrictions on our capacity to do anything with the prison population at Gitmo. It made it impossible for Obama to close that prison. That may have served the political interests of the Republican Party at the time, but it didn't really advance any particular national interest. And there were many issues like that where there was this increasingly politicized congressional engagement. Take the negotiation of treaties. Congress basically refuses to ratify any treaties anymore, in large part because the Republican Party has hostility to that. That denies the American government the capacity to effectively negotiate treaties. And even ones that shouldn't be particularly controversial, the treaty around the rights of people with disabilities. This is an international treaty rooted in the Americans with Disabilities Act, supported by people like Bob Dole, and yet we couldn't get that through Congress. So I think the politicization of these issues in Congress has eroded Congress's impact. And the one other thing I'd say about this, Lee, is that there's a lack of the kind of expertise in Congress that you had. When I moved to Washington, you had recently been in Congress. You had people like Senator Lugar, who had been there for decades, who knew about an issue like arms control, who could help literally contribute to the negotiation of our last major arms control treaty, the New START agreement with Russia, and then help shepherd it to ratification. There's been so much turnover in Congress, particularly in the Republican Party, that you just don't have the kind of depth of expertise on issues that you had in the 80s and 90s and 2000s when I was coming into politics. I'm really struck by it. Even the staff, congressional staff, doesn't have the same expertise. So I think one of the areas that most concerns me is, yes, the politicization of foreign policy in Congress, but also just the need to develop expertise on military policy, intelligence policy, and foreign policy that just isn't what it used to be.
Let me ask you a question about our allies. I think one of the attractive features of American foreign policy over the years has been that we have worked very closely with our allies to bring about the kind of international world order, if you will, that we'd like to see. Now, of course, we have all kinds of relationships. Some are almost adversarial. I guess they are adversarial. But I'm speaking not so much of those. I'm talking about our work with European allies and others. How important has that been? And what do you think the status of it is now? Are they uneasy about American global leadership today? And if so, why?
Well, I think the first thing is that Americans need to appreciate how much we get from having allies. These are the first people that we turn to when we have a problem. When we had a problem emerge in the Obama administration from ISIS, we could go to our European allies and they could contribute to that military coalition. They could help fund partners who are fighting ISIS on the ground in Iraq and Syria. They were a force multiplier in a way that China or Russia just doesn't have. They can't call in a network of allies to solve problems. And I could go down the list from public health to democratic values to counterterrorism. On issue after issue, we have a team. And the team is comprised of the United States and our European allies and our Asian allies. And that's a unique asset in the world. And again, one that I think people don't fully appreciate. Other big countries don't really have the same types of relationships, the kind of formal alliances rooted in a set of shared interests and values. I think that I've never seen in my lifetime our alliances in as bad a shape as they are today. President Trump, as a focus of his foreign policy, wanted to delegitimize and deprioritize these alliance relationships. And the US and Europe, for instance, didn't even agree on the goals of a lot of our policies. I think the European allies felt like they weren't listened to throughout the Trump presidency. They saw agreements that had been negotiated under past presidents, Obama agreements like the Paris Climate Accords or the Iran nuclear deal, torn up. But not just those agreements. I mean, there were agreements that dated back to the Bush 41 presidency that were torn up with respect to arms control. And all of that erodes trust. and erodes a sense of predictability that alliances depend upon. And so I think job one for Joe Biden is going to be restoring those alliance relationships and trying to begin to build back trust. Because without trust, you can't get things done. You can't negotiate diplomatic agreements if our allies think that we might end up violating them. You can't stand up for democratic values in a circumstance around the world if our allies don't think that the United States is going to apply those values with any consistency. So they've suffered, but I think, again, we need each other. We need each other more than ever before in terms of our allies. When you have a rising China, when you have a much more aggressive Russia, I'd rather go into those circumstances with friends. The last issue I'd stress here, for instance, Lee, is China. The Trump administration decided to confront China over some, very problematic trade practices, but they did it alone. They did it through a bilateral trade war, bilateral tariffs. If instead we had gone into a negotiation with the Chinese over those issues, together with Europe and our Asian allies like Japan and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand, we would have had 50% of the global economy with us in those negotiations. Yeah. That's just a stronger position to be in. And that's the position I think that hopefully President Biden can put us in.
I'm jumping around quite a bit here, but I won't keep you too much longer. But what about do you notice an ambivalence among the American people with regard to the U.S. role in the world? In other words, it seems to me that Americans want the United States to be a global leader. There'd be very broad agreement on that proposition, I think. At the same time, they don't like the costs of that leadership. They particularly don't like having young men and women put in places of danger. And of course, they don't like the huge taxes that have to be paid to support American foreign policy worldwide. So I find, and I'm asking you what your reaction is, this ambivalence. Now that could be the part of the country I come from, that's more pronounced, I don't know. But there really is we want you to get in there and lead, but don't spend too much money and certainly don't put our people and lives at risk.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important issue, but I think that the frustration and ambivalence and exhaustion in both parties, people in both parties, is chiefly with the wars. And it's chiefly rooted in the sense that we overreached after 9/11, particularly through the war in Iraq, but also through a war in Afghanistan that went on for 20 years. Wars that proved to be much more complicated and costly than the American people were told at the beginning of those wars. Mm-hmm. And Lee, I learned a lot about this from you. You were always a voice of kind of pragmatic restraint. You always raised what are the consequences of action, not just the consequences of inaction. And I think we lost sight of that. I think too much of the American foreign policy establishment in both parties doesn't take seriously enough that the American people are onto something when they ask questions about why we've had military deployments of this scale in the Middle East for this many years. All of that said, I think the problem is when American foreign policy writ large is equated with these wars. If you look at the war in Iraq, this was a mistake that cost this country trillions, with a T, trillions of dollars, when you add up the cost of the war and then the cost of caring for the veterans of that war and their wounds. The amount of money that it takes for America to make a difference diplomatically is a tiny fraction of that. And frankly, is not a big part of the US budget. And so I think our capacity to use diplomacy, to use foreign assistance, which is not a big part of the budget, to use our alliances to get things done around the world is frankly not that costly. And so in order to have the space to conduct, I think, constructive foreign policy, we have to take seriously the fatigue that Americans have with military engagements in the Middle East that have not yielded the results that they were told they would yield on the timelines that they were told. And it's time to turn the page on this chapter in the Middle East and with the post 9/11 era and get to a more sustainable resource allocation and prioritization of a different set of issues.
If you look at the developments in the world today in the last decade or two, uh, you can't help but notice the rise of China. And if you have conversations with people on an informal basis, this is the relationship that comes up. China is an impressive power. They've made a lot of progress over the last decade, several decades, but they also have a country that's got a lot of big problems along with it. Give me your thoughts, if you will, on this relationship. What's it look like to you? Is it, I've said, and I wonder if you agree, it's the most important bilateral relationship in the world. I think that's right. China is going to have a big time impact on all things that happen, certainly in that region of the world, but maybe beyond. And they seem to have the ambition under the president to want to do that. So what are your thoughts about this key, powerful, potent relationship, U.S. and China?
Well, I think it's the most important and complicated bilateral relationship in the world. During the Obama years, we found that to get big things done, the United States and China working together was usually essential. The two biggest issues were in the Obama years were, in the first term, it was American and Chinese cooperation to stimulate growth in the global economy that allowed for the global economy to recover from the financial crisis. And then it was the United States and China as the two biggest emitters of greenhouse gases working together that allowed for the negotiation of the Paris Climate Accords. On the other hand, in the Obama years, China began, particularly with Xi Jinping, to be much more aggressive. I think in the past, there was a sense that China was focused on its own internal affairs. We suddenly saw Xi Jinping being much more aggressive at home in the development of essentially a surveillance state with very limited rights, even relative to the already closed system in China, but also to begin to throw their weight around, particularly in the Asia Pacific, but increasingly in other parts of the world. And with Donald Trump as president, I think they rapidly accelerated, basically presenting themselves as an alternative to America, that we have an authoritarian model that is more efficient than American democracy. We're rich, we're growing, make your deals with us. They don't like international rules of the road that they have to follow. And that began to create significant tensions in the bilateral relationship and in the international system.
But
I think the answer, though, yeah.
You would agree that our engagement with China is essential, that we pursue that engagement in the years ahead, right?
Yeah, I think that you have to find that you cannot, look, I care a lot about climate change. You can't solve that problem if you don't engage with China. I think where we're competitive with China, the most important things that we can do, Lee, are at home. If we're concerned about China beating us for the technologies of the future, rather than going around the world and telling people not to use Chinese technology, let's invest in American technology and American innovation and the National Science Foundation and our research base in this country. That's what we did in the Cold War. We invested in our own model. If we care about Chinese authoritarianism gaining traction around the world, let's make American democracy a more attractive model. Right now, it doesn't look that good. We need to make sure that people's rights are protected here at home. We need to make sure that democracy can deliver for people if we're then going to go around the world and say, don't follow the path of the Chinese model on this. And then I think internationally, it's less about confronting China bilaterally and more about saying there need to be international rules of the road for how trade is conducted. And if China is violating those rules, we're going to get together with other countries to try to impose a consequence. If we don't like how China is claiming vast amounts of territory in areas like the South China Sea, it's not about us going to China bilaterally and saying, you don't do that. It's about us getting together with all the other nations in Southeast Asia and around the world and saying, no, this is how you draw maritime borders. You don't draw them by big nations just claiming a whole chunk of water. You do it through processes of international arbitration, international negotiation. So I think, yes, it's inevitable that the US is going to be in competition with China and sometimes in some degree of of conflict, not military conflict, but conflict over disagreements.
Yeah.
I would like us to see, I would like us to approach those areas of disagreement, from a position of let's invest in our own strength and our own model here at home. Let's work with others to reinforce international norms and rules and standards. And where China is violating them, we try to deal with that on a multilateral basis. Because I think there is a risk if this all becomes a bilateral conflict. There's a risk of military conflict, Lee. There's a risk of trade wars that end up hurting people here in the United States and in China. So I'm not naive about this. We need a tougher line in many respects, but I don't think that takes the form of a bilateral confrontation. I think that takes the form of America getting its act together, and then America working with the rest of the world to try to make sure that China is abiding by rules and norms, and if they're not, working with the rest of the world to impose consequences rather than just doing it ourselves.
I've taken enough of your time, but let me take one other question, if I may, and we'll conclude with this. As I indicated to you, I'm sitting at a School of Global and International Studies. One of the things that pleases me a great deal as I look at the problems you've been talking about is to see the quality of young people, students here at the university, who are interested in moving into the arena of foreign affairs, international relations, in the private sector, in the public sector, however defined. And it gives me a sense of hope to see their idealism, their pragmatism, their principled way of approaching these problems. And I sometimes, looking at the agenda, get kind of discouraged, but then I think of the students I see and the hope that gives me. I'd like you to comment on that as we conclude here.
Well, yeah, I'd say a few things. I completely agree with you. I draw all my optimism from young people. I think the first thing that people need to understand, young people in particular, is that politics and foreign policy is a human endeavor. It can seem like this massive machinery that just runs on its own. It doesn't. If you get involved, you can make a difference. If you don't, then you won't make a difference. After leaving working for you, I moved out to Chicago to work on a political campaign, the Obama presidential campaign, that when I went out to work there, I was 29, and I was one of the oldest people on the campaign. It was a few hundred people in a Chicago office and in Iowa, and they literally changed the direction of American history and world history. So one is, you have agency, and if you don't fill the space, other people will. I think the second thing is a lot of the issues that I think are most important, young people understand better, frankly, than anybody else. Technology and the disruptions of social media and disinformation and artificial intelligence. These require public policy responses that are international. Young people understand these technologies intuitively because they've grown up with them. Climate change, the stakes are much higher for younger people. And so the more younger people are involved in politics, the more politics is going to respond to the fact that this is an interest that is overwhelmingly the number one issue for people under the age of 30, for instance. So young people also, I think, have a better intuitive understanding of issues. And the other thing I'd say, Lee, is that there are many ways to make a difference, right? Yes, there's going in the government, going into the foreign service, the civil service, trying to work on political campaigns, trying to work in congressional offices. But universities, non-governmental organizations, international organizations, the private sector, interconnection to a lot of the issues we've talked about. You can be a globally engaged person in many, many different ways and make a difference. And this is like the last thing I'd say is that, the face we show to the world is not limited to the US government. And our business community, our academic community, our media, that tells a story to the world about who America is. And one of the things I think you really instilled in me early on is that some of the most effective programs of American foreign policy are things like education exchange programs, just the capacity for people to meet Americans and for Americans to meet other people, to get to know the people who are going to become the leaders of countries in the future. The more that young people in colleges and graduate schools are engaged in shaping global perceptions of America, the better off we'll be. Because I think there's a lot of goodwill towards Americans and particularly young people that is greater, frankly, than the goodwill towards our government. So my message is get involved. There are many ways to be involved. Shape the agenda. If you don't like the issues that people are focused on, if you're exhausted of policy debates only being about terrorism or taxes and not being about climate change and technology, you can make that difference too. But I think the hopeful thing I find is that young people in this country and globally are the most thoughtful citizens these days, and they're tired of corruption and they're tired of institutions that are not responsive to them. And my hope is that they can get their hands on the levers of power here and steer us in a better direction.
Well, what an extraordinary privilege it has been to be able to listen to Ben for these last few minutes. Ben, we want to thank you. Your words of insight and wisdom are impressive. I want you to know what an extraordinary privilege it has been for me to have people like you, and there have been scores and scores of them, fortunately, that I've had the privilege to work with. I've learned an awful lot more from them than they have from me. I'm confident of that. Your career, we continue to follow with enormous interest. We wish you well. We thank you for all the contributions you have made to American policy, and we wish for you and your family the very best. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and Lee, I'll say one more thing here, which is I think it's important for young people to get too that sometimes the biggest impact you make in even public life is on the other people that you come into contact with. And you mentioned the people who work for you. I happen to be one of them. But I look at the Obama administration. Our chief of staff, Dennis McDonough, a former Hamilton staffer. Our ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, a former Hamilton staffer. Yeah. Our top staffer on Latin America, Dan Restrepo. Chris Kojum, running the National Intelligence Council. The people that have been impacted by you and worked for you have gone on to do all manner of things. Your legacy isn't just those issues you worked on. It's all those things that those people worked for you, what they went on to do. And so it's an incredible example of how legacy is not just the laws you write or the oversight you conduct or the investigations you lead. It's what all the people that worked for you then themselves go on to do. And so hopefully there's a full appreciation of the living legacy of the hundreds of people, thousands who either worked for you or learned from you. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Ben Rhodes. We adjourn.
The Hamilton Lugar School at Indiana University is proud to present its inaugural Global Voices for Change Award to Wai Wai Nu. After 7 years as a political prisoner in Burma, Wai Wai Nu emerged as a prominent voice fighting for equal rights and democracy. In 2013, she founded Women's Peace Network. Since then, she has tirelessly fought against the political oppression, violence, and genocide that's plagued women, youth, and marginalized communities, especially those from the Rakhine State. Her continued peace-building efforts have earned her national and international recognition. She is currently a fellow at the Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. There, she is designing and implementing outreach efforts around genocide education and prevention. She's also serving as an advisor on the pursuit of justice and accountability in Burma. Ms. Nu now joins Ambassador Lee Feinstein, founding dean of the Hamilton Lugar School, in conversation about her views on the future of human rights and equality in her homeland and beyond.
Welcome. People in this country are understandably focused on the presidential election and transition here. But just a few days after Americans went to the polls, there was another consequential election with implications for democracy and human rights in Burma. We're here today to talk about the state of human rights and democracy in Burma, and especially on the plight of the persecuted Rohingya minority. And with us to understand these issues better is democracy and human rights activist Wai Wai Nu. Wai Wai Nu, thank you for joining us at our conference at the Hamilton Lugar School. Welcome and congratulations on receiving the Global Voices for the Future Award. And thanks to our friends at the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, where Ms. Nu is a fellow. The center is part of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I'm privileged to be a trustee. Wai Wai Nu, it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee. I'm very honored to be here with you.
Let's start with the November 8th elections. You discussed your concerns about that election recently in Time magazine and elsewhere. You've criticized the elections as institutionalizing disenfranchisement and normalizing discriminatory standards against ethnic groups, and especially the Rohingya minority. Can you explain for our audience how this election further marginalized ethnic communities, and especially the Rohingya?
Sure, thank you. I think it's a great question. So just to recall, Rohingya were first disenfranchised in 2015 election. And I must say that that was the only election or the parliament of Myanmar that there were no Rohingya representation, or there were no Muslim representations in the as a nation's parliament. And it happened in 2015, and so this is the second time. 2020 general election is the second time that the Rohingya were disenfranchised. And this time is not just Rohingya, but there are many other ethnic communities, especially those who are living in the conflict area and the civil war areas. And especially most of those are in Rakhine State. So at least 9 townships in Rakhine State, the election was canceled in 9 townships in Rakhine State. Apart from the at least 600,000 Rohingya and 1 million plus Rohingya in Bangladesh, populations of 1.4 Rakhine and ethnic minorities, 1.4 million Rakhines and other ethnic minorities were disenfranchised in this election, and which is a huge number. And I think it's a sort of like, basically the attitude of the government that in 2015, they faced no consequences for disenfranchising the entire Rohingya populations. And then this is the next step and next level of disenfranchisement. This time, not only they solidify the discriminatory practice and exclusions of Rohingya, but also extended the practices, and which is very dangerous when we talk about democracy transition. So what we've basically seen here is that we're not moving forward with the elections or with the democracy just merely because we have elections. Instead, we are backwarding. So that's what, for me, 10 years of so-called transitions from 2011 to 2020 it seemed to be. And for the Rohingya this time, there will be, of course, again, there will be no voices in the nation parliaments or any other places in the public services, because there is no Rohingya representations at all. So it's a form or a kind of like, it is assurance of the erasure of Rohingya, from complete erasures of Rohingya from the public service, and which is again, steps in atrocity crimes, or especially when we look back the history and in the context of genocide, the erasure or exclusions in the public participations is really an important element. So I felt very frustrated, and it is again very worried and concerned for my people.
And I guess one of the people who was excluded was your dad.
Yeah, totally. So when we talk about Myanmar as a country and democracy movement, since independence in 1948, our leaders has tried to build these nations as a more equal and fair and freer nation, freer country for all ethnic minorities. Along with that, my father fought and sought for democracy for his entire life, and a freer nations and equal nations for all ethnic groups. And my father was a school teacher, a politician, an activist when he was very young, and then he became an elected parliamentarian in 1990 election. He was a leader in forming teachers union during the 1988 student revolutions. And since then, he's been deeply involved in the democracy movement alongside with Aung San Suu Kyi. He was part of this opposition elite group called Committee Representing People Parliament, CRPP, which is 18 members of the ethnic leaders of ethnic communities across the country which allied with Aung San Suu Kyi to bring democracy in the country during the military dictatorship. And he was one of the person very closely worked with her, right? And she basically knows him very well. And the point here is my parents fought for democracy and freer nations alongside with the Burmese leaders. But today he is disqualified to run in the elections when he was eligible and qualified as a candidate and became a parliamentarian 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I guess. 1990s, okay, my math, 20 years ago. 20 years ago. At the age of like 75, he become like basically outsiders in his own country, the country that he fought for democracy and he sought for democracy. So it's just not about my father as individual. It's resonate many other Rohingya populations in the country, and it's very traumatic, and for us it's about dignity, it's about rights, it's about belonging, and it's about existence itself.
Well, I'm glad you made the connection to Aung San Suu Kyi and the history of your dad and her working together initially for democracy in the country. I know people ask you this all the time, but I think our audience would love to hear you talk about this. You know, many people here and around the world are trying to understand, as many magazine headlines have put it recently, what happened to Burma's human rights icon, Aung San Suu Kyi. And I know growing up, she was somebody who was a role model for you, and that also more recently, initially, you were fairly hopeful about what might happen if she and her party, the National League for Democracy, came to power, as it did in the election before last. When did you first begin to have serious concerns about the civilian government and Aung San Suu Kyi's leadership? And how has that accelerated in recent years?
Yes, so when we were released from the jail, my father, me, and my family, when we were released from the jail in 2012, with the presidential amnesty, at that time, about 600 other 620 political prisoners were released as well, along with us. So at that time, we were very, very hopeful for the country. We were looking forward to the leadership of Aung San Suu Kyi, and we had by-elections in 2012, and Aung San Suu Kyi won landslide. And we supported her wholeheartedly, with the hope that she will bring some light to the darkness and direct the country to the right direction. And we have this violence against Rohingya happened in Rakhine State in 2012, and it spread throughout the country. And there were chaos and atrocities. People were killed. Even young children were burnt alive and killed in some cases. And then the crisis has gone on to 2013, 14, and 15. Yet we thought she failed to speak up, and we understand she was not in power as a minority party in the parliament. So we kind of thought like, okay, she's not responsible for speak up or take actions, as she's not a government her party is not taken as a government role. So, and we thought, if she has a control over the government, she will take actions and she have authority to do so. So we gave her already space and understanding, and many of us, Rohingya, many people, like not many people, like the whole country, actually supported her in 2015 election. And then her party won landslide again, and she remained silent and take no actions. What happens is, in 2016 and 2017, under her administration, right, these clearance operations against Rohingya happened, and her government was the one basically, denying the crimes and the crisis. And there were incidents, there were cases where international media visited to Rakhine State when Rohingya women came out and say, I saw women were being raped and women were bleeding, and her office Facebook page came up with a big banner saying fake rape, as if Rohingya women were lying. And that broke my heart. And I was like, this is not going to work. And it was very emotional for me to see, to see someone I admire and look up to could be this much ignorance and denial, and even show no sympathy to fellow women. It was outrageous. So in 2016 and 17, when clearance operations happened in Rakhine State, her government denied the violence attack against Rohingya in many ways. One of the way in one incident when foreign international journalists and diplomats visited to Rakhine State, when women came out and said, I saw women were being raped and women were bleeding, and her office came up on her office Facebook page saying fake rape. So it was really outrageous for me to see someone who I look up to, someone who I admired for my entire life, deny the rape against fellow women and show no sympathy. Instead, saying it as a fake rape it's really unacceptable. It's unbelievable, and since then she basically stood for the perpetrators by even showing up in front of the International Court of Justice and denying the crimes that happen against the Rohingya populations. I think this is not something that we should we should expect for a Nobel laureate or democracy icon, and it is crucial for us, leaders don't use democracy solely for their gaining their power. No leaders use the name democracy as a means to obtain power. And I felt, and in that situation, we must hold those leaders more accountable. It is somehow understandable that authoritarian governments, dictators, behave in such manner. But when you claim to be fighting for democracy and human rights, it is unacceptable to deny such gross human rights violations and international crimes and ignore the suffering of the people.
Do you have any hope that this government will change its policies?
So, since 2015, the NLD government came into power, and until now, the situations of Rohingya in the ground has changed nothing. And when we look back, all of the processes, not only that in this period, the mass atrocities had happened and continue to happen, but also the government actually has been institutionalizing and solidifying the discriminations and persecution policies of persecutions. Basically, they are implementing or legitimizing or legalizing all these discriminatory policies that has been introduced by the military government. For example, and national verification card process, which is to deny to the existence and the belonging of the Rohingya people in the as a bona fide citizens, which is aimed to create them second class or third class citizens. That is how the Rohingya said this card is a genocidal card. And her government is actively continuing this process, forcing people to take this card. And on the other hand, there is no progress on the return of 130,000 internally displaced person in Rakhine State. Instead, they are building these permanent camps-like structures called model villages, which will create a permanent segregations between Rakhine and Rohingya. And again, disenfranchisement, excluding the Rohingya from the politics, in public services. It's all of these steps are, for me, it's more it's more like scary and dangerous than the military government. When this conduct is done under democratically elected government, it's justified somehow to be truth, and it will be very difficult to repair and rebuild. That is why it is more concerning than the conduct and act and violation that has happened under the military government. So I feel there will be no change if there is no accountability, and if there is not enough diplomatic pressure, and not enough, like if there is not, if there is no, like, I guess, international pressure. So we need it. Otherwise, they will not change anything, because it's not about the Aung San Suu Kyi or NLD government or the military themselves. Even it's not about even, I mean, it's not just about the institutions or the individuals. It's the mindset that exists in Burma, a mindset of this Buddhist supremacism, and the mindset of Burmanizations, the mindset that they see the people like us as outsiders, that has been deep rooted within the people. So sometimes I don't feel like, talking about individuals or and institutions. It's about the behavior and mindset that has to be changed. And that will never be changed without pressure, until they realize this is wrong thing to do, and they must act and they must change their behavior. And it will only be happen with the pressure, because we have seen since 2012, 2011 to 2020, the world has actually given options, and the world has rewarded them for doing nothing. And the world has engaged, many world leaders actually has met with the Aung San Suu Kyi and explained her they need to change, right? But there were no progress happened. Instead, we are backwarding, yeah.
Can you say a little bit more for us about the remnant Rohingya community? I guess the 600,000 or so that are still in the country. You've said that you believe that the Rohingya may be facing extinction, and you're not alone in thinking that. Are you concerned about the vulnerability of the remnant population in northern Rakhine State? What are the conditions there, and is there a risk of a second genocidal wave?
So some scholars actually describe the situations in Rakhine State, and especially the treatment of Rohingya, as slow genocide. So I'm not sure there will be another immediate, violence attack will happen like in 2016 or 2017. And of course, in 2016 and 2017, none of us would, none of us thought that would happen, right? It was unexpected for us, but for the perpetrators, it might not be unexpected, right? But now, I cannot imagine something that would happen in the near future. However, as many scholars describe, this as a slow burning genocide, the processes are ongoing. Basically, leaving people with no choices, without identity, without ability to move even within your village or beyond your village, without ability to study, without access to healthcare, without access to economic activity opportunities. you know, and again, many other form of tortures and violence, for instance, extortions, arbitrary arrests, killing, you know, the sexual harassment. All of these are like everyday, daily tortures to the people, and that leave people no choices. That's why we're seeing, you know, even in this, during the pandemic, people are leaving from the country by these small boats with they could end up in the middle of the sea. And there is and people are choosing to leave the country, and we have reports of people died for having um, um, for not having this access to healthcare. All of these things are continuing. It's ongoing. So, you know, I cannot predict what would happen, but we are in a very dangerous zone, and we must act now. Otherwise, you know, I can't imagine what could happen. Again, you know, we have this 130,000 people locked up in internally displaced person camp. They cannot go out of their camps. And we have this ghetto-like conditions in Sittwe city, a quarter called Aumengla quarter. They cannot go out of from that quarter. And these are daily, the torture and the persecutions, the trauma for the community, daily basics, and it's ongoing.
It's a truly desperate situation. Well, you talked about the international response and how to try to take steps to change things and stop this. And in that regard, I wanted to cite a statement that the now Secretary of State designate, Antony Blinken, made on the 3rd anniversary of the atrocities last August. He said in a statement, "A Biden administration will work tirelessly to support justice for atrocities committed, as well as peace, security, and equal rights for the Rohingya as citizens of Burma." So in your judgment, what does the world community, including the United States, need to do to support the goals that Secretary-designate Blinken listed?
Yeah, I'm very pleased to see his statement on the 3rd anniversary of the Rohingya genocide on August 24th. He posted it, if I may correct, if I'm not wrong. And I truly hope that the Biden administration will take proactive approach in stopping atrocity crimes in Rakhine State and in bringing justice for the Rohingya, as well as, you know, the equality of Rohingya and all other ethnic minorities in Myanmar. So the U.S. government has been very passive over the past 8 years, over the past 2 administrations, and we feel the U.S. has failed us. And now it's the time for the U.S. to fix it. And it is crucial that U.S. take leadership. And I repeat it in all administrations, and I reminded them, I hope they're not going to make another mistake. If U.S. take leadership and the world follow, the Western government follow. And when it's come to Burma democracy and human rights, the U.S. government was the one leading the movement and took leaderships up to 2010. And that leadership we needed again to really change the situations in the ground. We cannot, you know, I want to repeat this, we cannot we cannot achieve democracy when the entire community is excluded and made to be outsiders. We cannot make democracy work on the bones and the blood of Rohingya. You know, it has to come to hands in hands. The equal rights and justice of the Rohingya is as equal as Burma's democracy. We cannot work, you know, we cannot separate the issue. And that is one thing that the world must understand and take the approach. Right now, the behavior of many governments and institutions is that, okay, when we promote democracy in country, the other issues will be solved, including the issue of Rohingya. And I think that approach is really wrong. That approach is really wrong in many ways. First of all, if, as I said, this discriminations, these policies become legitimized and legalized, it will be extremely harder to change. And the leadership right now, the way they set example, it will make even harder for a community like Rohingya to be integrated, to get any sort of justice, or to even let alone equal rights. It will be extremely hard. On the other hand, when we talk about atrocity crimes and the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity, there is a moral and legal obligations from the to bring justice and accountability for those crimes. This is essential. We have at least two processes. One is the democratization process, which assure the rights of the Rohingya, which protect the rights of the minorities, which include the Rohingya and assure equal rights. On the other hand, we also it is crucial, we have another processes that bring justice and accountability for the survivors and victims. I think these two need to come together in a comprehensive approach. And talking about US, I believe US should invest in the global justice issues more than ever now. And again, I would really love to see the Biden administration taking leadership in this and prioritizing the issue of Rohingya, and listening to people like us and other ethnic minorities, representative from the other ethnic minorities in Burma.
So do you think it's important then that the US government or others, international bodies, make a formal finding that the actions of the government of Myanmar constituted genocide?
So, of course, I think there has been finding and investigations and researches ongoing. Of course, we had the finding of the international fact-finding missions, which was mandated by the UN Human Rights Council and UN General Assembly. The report details these gross human rights violations committed by the Myanmar military. Again, U.S. State Department itself conducted this huge research on the Rohingya.
Mm-hmm.
And it is not about, finding and investigations anymore. Now it's the time to acknowledge the crime as it is, and name the crime as it is. That is what important. Acknowledging the crime as it is acknowledging the suffering and the tragedy that happened to the Rohingya people, that happened to the victim, and that will bring enormous change to the life of the people, especially the victims and survivors, and for the people in general in Burma. Because I believe without acknowledging what happened to the people, without acknowledging the crime as it is, we cannot find a true real approach, a right approach to address any such thing. US has been naming the situations of Rohingya as ethnic cleansing. To be honest, ethnic cleansing is not even a crime under international law. And there has been campaign ongoing to, for the State Department, for the US government to call it as genocide, but they're not listening. And I think this is very, very sad and irresponsible for a government like US ignoring such crimes and remain in silence.
I'd like to ask one more question about international response, and then I'd like to ask you some questions more about the culture in Burma that you've talked about earlier. It's a question about sanctions. So shortly after the first election, which brought the NLD to power, the United States acted to lift sanctions. And some people question if that was premature. And I'm curious what you think about that. And also, what about going forward?
Yes, I do think, I said it before, the lifting sanctions on Myanmar, rewarding and praising for flawed democracy was not helpful. And since 2011, 2012, when the so-called democratizations or democratic transitions happened, the world was so excited and started this completely give up anything, that any principle and standard that may have before, and started engaging with Myanmar without having any conditions and lifting sanction. I think that somehow gives signal to the perpetrators, or signal to the at least military, to continue carry on the crimes against the Rohingya populations. And again, that level of engagement, that level of excitement and praise actually has left us with nothing, with no progress. So moving forward, I'd like to say, not just me, many of us working very closely on the human rights violations across the country, in Rakhine State, in Kachin State, Shan State, and in other part of the country. We want to see the US government and other government put the sanctions on, specifically on the military and military-owned businesses. So we want to see more increase the targeted sanctions against the military and military businesses. And we also want to see diplomatic pressures and actions at the UN by having explicit measures and benchmark, and by putting conditions, not like just not like meeting with the leader and saying that we want to see you doing this. It doesn't work. We want you to be more explicit. We want you to be to put conditions on and conditions and terms and benchmark. Otherwise, we will see no progress again, and it will be another 10 years, and we don't know where the people, the Rohingya people, life will be, but we will see no progress, and we don't want to make it that mistake again in the Biden administration. We really need you to have a more constructive and a more holistic approach when it's come to the Myanmar foreign policy.
When we were talking earlier, you talked about the culture in Burma, and I wanted to ask you, as we come to the end of our conversation, to talk a little bit more about that, and also about your work. You said to officials at the UN recently that in Burma, discrimination is embedded in the culture, mindset, and daily life, and you said as much earlier in our conversation. How do you go about the difficult work of changing that?
I mean, I understand, I want to be very clear. There is a need to bring justice for the victims and survivors. There is a need to push government to do the right thing. On the other hand, there is a process that we need as a country to change mindset and behavior, to seed a mindset of a more inclusive futures for all people in the country. So the system that we had under military dictatorship since 1962 to up to today, you know, that systems actually create divisions and increases seeded nationalisms within the people based on, uh, it's not just the Burmese, Buddhist, or Burman ethnic populations, but it's shared across the country. It was also a result of this divide and rule tactics that the military introduced, and it's also about the favoritism that has the privilege that has enjoyed by the Burmese majority. And it was also about this entire education systems and the culture of the government, the behavior of the government. These all resonate to the attitude and behavior of the people today. So we need to have this drastic change in different, from different approaches. And one way to do so is supporting more democratic civil society. The civil society organization that work on promoting democratic principles, promoting human rights principles, and also investing in education. And it will be a long process. We understand we have to be patient, and we are ready to work on it. But what we need is the world need help us to bring justice for the survivors and victims. And what we need immediately is the world give us protections to stop ongoing human rights violations and ongoing risks of genocide. When we have that, it is easier for us to start this long process of changing mindset and to build in a more inclusive country. Right now, people, it is especially when it's come to Muslims and Rohingya, there is a deep-rooted hate and prejudice, and this needed a lot of work to basically, make people understand the religion is about individual belief. It's not, it shouldn't be something that divide us, but instead we are one human, we're one country. This country is a very diverse country from the beginning, and we all belong to this country, and we must build mutual understanding and respect, and create a society where we can all live together and look for prosperity of the country. That is the mindset, that the vision that we all need to seed to the to the people of the country, and which is again long process. We need your support in many ways. More importantly, as I said, we need you to support ending atrocity crimes and ending human rights violations, as well as bringing all the perpetrators accountable, so that it will be easier for us to continue having faith in what we do.
Thank you. And finally, following up on this point, in your work, you focused on defending the rights of women and girls, especially. Can you tell us a little bit more about this work and why that focus?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it has a different factors. When I was in the prison, I met so many young women inside the prison, from the political prisoners to, prostitutes. All of this, when I talked to many of them, hundreds of them, over the 7 years of period, I realized how women are treated differently, how the systems suppress the women in particular, how the impact of the women in each step of their life is different than men. And I basically understand came to realize the gender inequality, how deep is that? And I thought, as a teenager at that time, I thought that was wrong and that shouldn't happen. Maybe I could do something when I released from the jail. That was, my kind of like initial thought. But then when I actually become an activist and when I started my work, and I realized the women voices are lacking in the decision making platform, and not only among the Rohingya but also in general, women participations in the policy making processes, women participations in the activism, women participations in the in politics, in peace building, it's very, very low. So women are we are half of the populations, average half of the populations in almost all society. Sometimes it can be even higher. In the case of Myanmar, I think it's 53%. So women are not represented enough. I think it's crucial that we bring women voices in the table. And again, when we go back to this, the conflict and atrocity crimes, in this context, women are the one who suffer the most, and women are the one vulnerable, and their voices are always left out. So I think it is essential that from the beginning, when we start our work, we have a greater focus on gender equality and bringing women voices to the table and finding solution together. Otherwise, we're missing the core, and we won't be solving the problem that we shared, especially the issues that women suffer.
Wai Wai Nu, thank you for sharing this very powerful and difficult story with us. Thank you for taking part in our conference. And I know I speak for everybody when I say we wish you and your family the very best in your important work. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I wish you the same.
Thank you.